Hey class, in this video we'll be talking about the Document Object Model, and we'll be starting a new project that we'll spend a couple weeks working on, making a JavaScript based quiz game. And so in this video I'll be going over some of the basics of connecting our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript into one project, introducing some new ideas while covering some old concepts from programming like variables and functions and conditionals. In this first part of the video, we're just going to set up our HTML page with a bit of CSS and connect our JavaScript just to get started. First, I want to talk about what we'll be building, and then we'll get set up. So when we start a new web app, there's a bunch of different decisions that go into where the content goes versus the functionality. These decisions kind of depend on what the end goal of the project is. I'll be talking about the decisions that I make as I design the app and begin to write the code. So to start, I want to talk about what the project is going to do and use the interface as a way of talking about it. So I'm going to open up a little drawing here. And so we're going to be making a quiz app. One of the things we have to decide is how to divide up our different content. So when we're building the quiz, we have HTML. Okay, that's the content of our page. We have CSS. That's the style of the page. And of course, we have JavaScript, which is going to provide some of the functionality. You could definitely build a project like this using nothing but HTML and CSS by adding lots of links that go to different places and, tally up a score somehow. But JavaScript is going to allow us to add in the functionality of a quiz and be able to very easily change the questions or adopt different numbers of questions or do other things. So one way we could do this, to explain a bit more, is we could have like one really long HTML page, and we could have our title and some instructions and then a bunch of questions, and we could write them all out in HTML. And we could use, links or just a minimal amount of JavaScript to say, did I get this right or wrong? Did I get this right or wrong? Did I get this right or wrong? And add up a score. And so in that case, your JavaScript page would probably look something like this. It would just be, a few lines. So that's one way that we could go about it. Another way that we could go about it is to have a very simple HTML page. Okay, so here's our HTML. And we'll just have like the title, and we'll have like a button to click to start the quiz, and then we'll use our JavaScript to generate everything else. And so the JavaScript will have, some questions. Let's say it's question 1, question 2, and it will keep track. It'll actually build some HTML inside of here. So we'll build our quiz questions and put them on the page, and then we'll also keep track of them to say if we get it right or wrong. And then eventually, we'll put the score on the page and the quiz or whatever else. And so this is the method that we're going to go over in these videos, because it's going to lead to a system where we can very easily create new quizzes with different questions. And instead of having to copy and paste a bunch of HTML and change parts here and there, all we're gonna have to do is just change a few questions and use the exact same code. So the JavaScript is gonna be a lot easier to reuse for different quizzes, to update our quiz. Imagine you make some HTML and you've got a whole quiz. So there's like thousands of lines of HTML just going, all the way down. And then you decide, well, actually, I want to change one quiz item. So now you have to search up and down to find that item and change it. In JavaScript, our quiz questions are just going to be right at the top, independent from the rest of our code. Another thing is in HTML, let's say you decided to change one class name because it didn't match what you wanted. Then you're going through, again, lines and lines and lines of code to change that one class name. In JavaScript, because we reuse our code rather than repeating it, you just have to find that class name and just take one out and put another one in. So that's why we're going to be approaching this with a much more JavaScript focused. So let's talk about our quiz interface. So one of the things that we have to do as we're designing the program is decide what we want to happen. So to start, we could either just have a question just immediately right here, or we could have some kind of start button. Okay. Either way is fine. I'm going to start with the start button. Once we start the quiz, we could just put all the quiz questions one after the other on the page, or we could start with one quiz question. And when the user answers it, they could hit a next button and go to the next one. That's one thing that we'll have to consider as we build the interface. As we're making the quiz, we'll have to have a question. So we'll have like, what is 1 + 1? And then we'll have to have some answers. So we could list our answers like this. We could list our answers as boxes that you click on. They could be images or text. There's a lot of different decisions that we'll make as we go. Another thing, so let's say we go with these boxes, which is what I'm going to do. And let's see, you have these answers and I click on the wrong answer. Do we show that that's the wrong answer, or do we not reveal the answers until we get to the end? So these are different questions that we have to think about as we're designing the quiz. I'm going to go ahead and just show the user if they got the question right, but I'm not going to allow them to change their answer. So I'll indicate visually and maybe with like a little message down here if you got the question right, and then you'll click on the next button to go to the next point of the quiz. So there's a lot of different decisions you make when you design a web app, and the decisions that you make in your project do not necessarily have to be the same as the decisions I make. And I'll try to talk about the decisions that I'm making as I build out the app so it makes sense. However, there is no one way that's better than others. There's just ways that are more efficient or more preferable to the way that you want to do. I'm going to try to do my version of this quiz app in the most efficient way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right way. So let's get started. I'm going to open up GitHub Desktop. So I'm on my repo 310, and I'm going to go to Show in Finder. So this is going to be my second project, so I'll make a new folder and call this project 2. And then eventually when I finish this, I can call it quiz project or whatever. And actually, let's call it project 2-1 because I'm probably going to make a few different versions of it. So that'll make it easier in the future. And then I'm just going to throw MMP 310 over into Sublime and increase the size a bit. And so I'm going to open up my project 2 folder. I've got nothing in there at the moment. So I'm just going to start with a new HTML file. So I'm going to start a new file and save as. And go to project 2-1 and call this index.html. I'm going to increase the size a bit. So now we just have to make a simple HTML page. I'm not going to spend a ton of time reviewing this because it should be pretty familiar to you guys. But if you do have questions, let me know. So I'm just going to say doc type HTML and make my HTML node, and then make my head section and my body section. And let's put a little space there. And then for my head section, pretty much the same stuff I always have. I'm gonna need a meta char set equals UTF-8. And I'm gonna need a link to the style sheet that I'll create in a moment. So I'll say link href get style.css and rel get style sheet. And let's add a title. So we'll call this JavaScript Quiz. Okay, and I think that's all I need, but we can always come back if I need to add something later. So that's my head section, that's looking good. So let's start on the body section. And so here's where we can start to kind of sketch out the basics of our interface and talk about what's going to be in our HTML versus in our JavaScript. So I always want to start with a container. So I'm going to say div ID equals container. This is just going to allow me to center my content on the page easily. So then I'm going to start to divide up what I want in my quiz. So I'll start with a header section, and I'll just have like a title here. So this is JavaScript Quiz. And then that's all I'll have in there. If I want to add some like a logo or something like that later, I can always do that. So I think that's fine. And now I'm going to have my interface, what I'm going to call my interface section. And so in here, I'm going to have like the start button and like a message and the next button and stuff like that. And then finally, at the bottom here, I'm going to have my quiz section. So I'll just call this quiz. That'll be kind of like the main container for the quiz itself. And in the interface, we can add a few things. We may come back and add more stuff later. So One thing I'm going to want to have is like a start button so the user can start the quiz. So I'm going to use a button element here. And so I'm going to use start as the ID. And I'm going to say start quiz. And so the user will just click that button to start the quiz. So I'll also add a button to go to the next question. So say ID equals next. I don't think I'll have anything else named next in here, so that should be fine. I guess if I had like a lot of quizzes, I could have like next quiz. And so then I would want to change those. But for now, I'll just stick with next and I can change it later if I need to. So this will be next question. We'll probably not show that at the beginning and then bring it in later. For now, I'll just leave that as is. I can do that with some styling. I'm just going to put some spaces here to make this a little more readable. I also probably want some kind of like message here that I can change as we go through the quiz. So I'm going to put a paragraph here, say ID equals message. Usually you want to have something that you can, let the user know what's going on if you need to give them instructions or say you got that right or you got that wrong. And so I'm just going to start with a message that says click to start the quiz. Even though the button says start quiz, I can just have like a placeholder for this message and I'll update it as we go. And so that looks pretty good to start. Let's take a look at what that looks on the browser. So I'm going to start the Sublime server and open up a new window. It's pretty big. So let's go to localhost 8080. And I'm going to have to type in the URL here because I haven't added my links yet. So, basic web page. I don't have any styles or anything. You can kind of see what the basic styles are here. Let's add a little bit of CSS so that this doesn't look so bland. But I'm not going to spend a ton of time with the CSS. So here's our HTML, and we can add some CSS. So let's start with that. So I'm going to add a new file and save this as style.css. And we'll have to add more stuff here as we go. Let's just start out with a font. We always want to have like a good font. So I'm going to go to Google Fonts, and I'm going to choose a couple different fonts, something for like most of the stuff, like most of the content, and then we'll have like a different font for the quiz answers. So I like this for the answers to the quiz. So I'm going to select just the regular one of this. So that looks good. And then the nice thing about Google Fonts is I can select a couple different styles and then add them together. And you don't have to use Google Fonts, but I'm just trying to make it look better from the beginning. So what's a good font for the rest of the content? This one's kind of nice. I'll go with this. If I get tired of it, I'll just change it later. So now I have a couple styles. And so you can see they're both in here in the import. Okay, so part of the reason I'm doing this now is because it is the first thing I want to put in my CSS page. So I'm going to copy that import tag there and then go back to style.css. And so now I have my two fonts. This is the first thing that I want to import because we need to make sure to load the fonts before we try to use them with our styles. Then let's add some basic body rules. So maybe we'll change the background color to something a bit more fun. So I'll say background color is, let's say, light blue. Okay, and then we can change our font family. So I'm going to use the PT Sans as the kind of default font. So that's PT Sans. And I'll add in a sans serif just in case, somebody isn't able to load that. Notice that like my buttons didn't take on that font. So the buttons, if you've never used HTML interface elements before, they have like a lot of default rules. So you can see them all down here. There's like a ton of them. There's an easy way to undo those rules. Sometimes the rules are nice if you just want like something really simple. You're not trying to make it look specific one way or another. But I'm going to be changing the button styles a little bit. So an easy way to get rid of those button styles is we can add a button selector and just say all and just say inherit. So now all of those styles are gone. So all obviously selects all of the rules, and then inherit means that it inherits from whatever it's inside of. So, at the moment, the only styles I've added are to the body, And so the button is just picking up all those styles. So obviously once we do that, we have to make the button, visible as a button again. So we'll come back to styling the button in a moment. Let's center our content. So let's add this container. I'm gonna set a max width. 960 is usually like a default that I'll start with. And then I can say margin is 0 auto. So that'll kind of center my content. And maybe I'll actually make it a little bit smaller here as I'm working on it. So let's set it to like 720 while we're working. There are some other defaults here, like our header has this H1. I actually don't really mind the size here, but I do think the size for this one should be a bit bigger. That's the paragraph. So I'm just gonna change the color of the H1. So I'm gonna say the color is, let's say orange. I think that'll go nice with the light blue. Actually, it's a little, on my screen, that looks a little, not enough contrast. What about dark orange? That's a bit nicer. I think that looks good, and that's kind of like BMCC colors, so I kind of like that. And then for my paragraph, I do want that to be a bit bigger. So let's try 1.5 EM as the font size. So that's a little bit more readable. That looks pretty good. It's almost as big as the header, so maybe we can bring that down a little bit. Okay, that looks good. That looks pretty good to start. So then with my interface, so I think what I want to do with these guys, right now I just have 1, 2, 3 elements, and I'd like them to kind of be across the page rather than on top of each other. So I'm gonna try display flex here. So that looks okay. There is like this default margin in my paragraph, so let's try turning that off. And then the buttons are much smaller, so let's make sure they have the same font size as the text. We can always update that later. I'm just testing this out in Chrome at the moment. I don't want to commit to it quite yet. So I have the display flex. I'm going to try to justify the content, and I'm going to say, let's say space evenly. Let's say space around. So yeah, we get, that's not exactly what I want. Let's see, I have the interface. Space around, space between. If I do space between, okay, that's what I want. And then I kind of want my buttons to be to this other side. But I might be like bringing them in and out. I might have to change this later, but I think if I say just for the start button, margin left is auto, there we go. That's what I want. And then I'll say margin right is 1 EM. So that's good. That's kind of the interface I want. I might make some changes here later, but this looks pretty good to start. So I'm gonna copy these rules for my interface. So that's the ID interface section. So I'm gonna do hashtag interface. Display is flex. And justify content is, what did I say? Space between. I'm running through this a bit quickly because really, styling is not exactly the point of this, of what we're working on here. Okay, I have to reset the margin to 0 for the paragraph, but we do want it to not look horrible as we're working on it. So I'm just doing some quick styles. So then finally we have for our button, well, this is a button inside the interface. So I don't want this to be all of my buttons. So I'm gonna go interface and then button, and font size 1.25 EM. Actually, I think that would be for all of my buttons. So let's put that up here. Oh, I guess everything else is just my start button. So I can get rid of this and I'll just say button ID start. And I want margin left is auto and margin dash right is 1 EM. Okay, cool. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on CSS in here, but I just want to go over a couple things so that it doesn't look really bad while we're working on this. But also just a reminder that, just going over the different languages. So we have the HTML where we set up kind of our basic content, like we have, the title of our page and some basic interface stuff. And then we have the CSS, which is used to make visual changes. And then the last thing we're obviously going to add on top of that is the JavaScript. And the JavaScript is what's going to add the functionality, which actually determines if we got the answer right and what our score is and things like that. And all of these three things actually interact. So for example, with our JavaScript, when the user clicks on an option or an answer for their quiz, not only are we going to be updating the JavaScript, we're also going to be changing the HTML and changing style.css to give visual cues to, whether you got the answer right or wrong. So we're going to be moving between all three languages to build out this web application. Let's add just a quick button style. For the button, usually you have a border, right? So I'm going to say border, let's give it like a 2 pixel radius, solid, and we'll just make it the same color. Okay, that looks okay. Let's add a border radius so it looks more like a button. So let's say 0.25 EM. And let's give it a little bit of padding so the border isn't so close. So we'll say padding is 0.25 EM. Okay, starting to look more like buttons. One issue now is that you can see the text isn't aligned. We can fix that if we go to our flexbox and say align items and let's say baseline. No, let's say center. Center is good. So that's in my interface. Since it's a flexbox, we can align the items in the center, so then we don't have to worry about the text lining up. Okay, so these look more like buttons. We also, since they're buttons, so we're not actually going to be using like regular buttons and links because it's just a one-page web app. So the little cursor guy isn't going to show up when we hover over here, but we can force that. So we can say button cursor is pointer. So now we know that that's interactive. And then let's make a little hover state. So we'll say button hover, and we'll just change the color. So let's just invert the colors. So let's give it a background color besides just a border. So we'll say background is, we can try the orange. I think it might look bad, but let's give it a shot. What did I say? Dark orange. Yes, that does not look great. What if we change, instead of the background, what if the color is orange and the border is orange? Okay, and if we hover, let's make the background dark orange, and the color goes back to black. That looks okay. It doesn't look great, but it looks okay. Kind of looks like a button. And then we need an active state, so if we say button active, let's just change the border color to black. That's not great, but you guys can work on that to make it look better if you want. It's kind of close to Halloween right now, so maybe that's why I'm thinking about orange and black. But that looks good enough for now. We can always fix those later if we don't like them. Actually, now that I'm looking at this, I think I'd prefer the black color for the text. Let's go back to our HTML. And what we're going to do now, this is going to be a little bit backwards. Usually we wouldn't like make a bunch of HTML and then just rewrite it in JavaScript. But the reason I'm going to do this is because I want to demonstrate how creating HTML with JavaScript is really the same thing as creating it with HTML. But I also want to go over how JavaScript is made with HTML. So that's the main thing that we're going to be learning in this video that you probably haven't learned before. So I'm going to create a quiz question as a model of what that quiz question should look like. And then we'll design a JavaScript function that will recreate that quiz question. And that way we can use JavaScript, which we can reuse the code rather than copying and pasting. So I'm going to build that HTML first, and then I'm going to add a script that will do it with JavaScript. So with our quiz, we're going to have questions. So let's say we have a div, and we're going to have multiple questions. So this can be a class. So we'll say question. And so inside that question, so we actually need more than, we're going to need like a question and like a wrapper for the whole like question itself. So let's call this the question container. And then we can have like a, maybe we'll use an H2 here. So we'll have an H2 that has the actual question. And so let's make a fake question. We'll say, what's 1 + 1? And then we're going to need another container for our answers so that we can design them to sit next to each other instead of on top of each other. So let's say div class gets answers. And so for our answers, we'll have a few different options. So we'll have div class equals option. And so the first answer might be like 0. And then the next answer might be like 1. And then the last answer might be like 2. So then we'll close the answers div, and let's close the questions div, and look at that. So that looks okay, right? We have our question here. We have a few different answers. We're gonna have to design those a little bit better. Right now, the answers are always gonna be in the same order. So the right answer is, on the right, but we could change that in the HTML. We're also gonna look at different ways to shuffle things in JavaScript so that it can be random every time you take the quiz, which is something that, you probably could do with HTML, but not really. So that's more of a JavaScript thing. And so let's style that up just a little bit. Let's take our question. That actually looks fine, but let's style up our answers a bit. So I want these guys to be sitting next to each other. So let's go again with the flex box. So for the answers div, I'm going to say display is flex. And justify content, we're going to do space between again. And then align items, I guess we'll do center again. I don't know if this one is going to matter as much. And then for our options, let's make a style for the option here. Again, this is just in Chrome. I'm just going to test this and then we'll build it. Font size has got to be bigger. Let's try 2EM. Let's put a little border around these guys. Maybe again, 2 pixels, solid. Let's go with the dark orange again. And let's put a little background color. Maybe we'll do like purple. That doesn't really work with the black color. So let's say the color is white. And let's give it some padding. Or actually, you know what we can do since it's a flex item is give it a flex basis of like 200 pixels. I think that works fine. Let's give it a height to match that, 200 pixels. This might not work as well if we have like more answers or something like that, but let's just stick with this for now. And then to center it, this is gonna be a little weird because it's inside of a flex box, but the easiest way to center things these days is actually using a flex. So let's do display flex for these items as well. And then just say justify content is center and align items is center. That looks pretty good. And for the let's do another border so it looks like our buttons. So let's say border radius is let's say 1 EM. Let's say 0.5 EM. Okay, and let's actually increase the border size. So let's say 5 pixels, or let's say 8 pixels. All right, that actually looks not bad for our options. So I'm gonna stick with this. So that's kind of good because I didn't really add a lot of styles there, but it looks kind of nice already. So I have my class answers. So there's gonna be lots of answers, right? Or there's gonna be lots of questions. So there's, we're gonna have classes here instead of IDs. So for answers, I have these rules. I'm just gonna copy these over. So display is flex, justify content, space between, align item center. And then for our options, so that's dot option. So the options are like the options for the different answers. I'm just gonna copy these in. So font size is bigger. I'm gonna group these together. So border and border radius, background color, and then the size is flex basis and height. And flex basis, if you haven't seen that before, that just basically means like within the flex box, because it is inside of a flex box, it's gonna try to take up 200 pixels if that's available, but if it's not, then it, it can shrink or do something else. So that looks good enough for now. I might have to make some adjustments later, but this looks pretty good. These guys I can also click on, so let's also add the cursor is pointer. Okay, pretty good. And then we also need like a hover state, right? So let's say dot option hover. Let's change the color. So I'll change it to like blue, I guess. Let's change the background color to blue. That actually looks okay. And let's do a nice little transition. So we'll say transition, background color, and let's just do a short one, 200 milliseconds. Okay, and I'll just add an easing function in here so it looks a bit nicer, ease in. So that'll make it animate slower at the beginning and then faster at the end. So that looks pretty good. The CSS is not great. You guys should definitely spend more time on that if you want it to look better, but it's good enough for what I want to do. Okay, so we've covered some HTML, we've created some content, we've created some CSS. Now what I want to do is just start talking about JavaScript